Story 1. My ex and I were moving out after our breakup and cleaning the garage. She was critical of my plan to move in with a coworker until I could find a better place, as most options weren't ideal. I took a deep breath and laughed, which puzzled her. "Why are you laughing?" she asked. I collected myself and said, "Because this is the last time I have to listen to this. You don't get to be critical of anything I do ever again." It felt incredible because I was genuinely thinking of the moment when I realized she had no power over me as I laughed. Story 2. A woman complained that we wouldn't fill her obviously fraudulent prescription, so she brought the brand new store manager to the pharmacy to insist that we fill it. "She says you have to fill it," the manager told us. I replied, "No one can make us fill anything if it doesn't pass the checks." Story 3. I work as an IT administrator, and we have a few particularly difficult clients. One of the usual callers contacted us angrily, demanding refunds because he managed to crash his server again for the 5th time in 3 years. This is the type of person who has inappropriate content on his business computer. After he spent a few minutes harassing the women who manage our phone lines, I got permission from my boss to take a strong approach. Let me say this. Telling someone in a professional setting to stop acting like an immature person and that they are their own worst enemy felt empowering. I emphasized that only a child would immediately start harassing the only people capable of helping him. I ended the call by informing him that we would refuse to assist him until he calmed down. He eventually did, and not only did he call back to apologize, but he also never acted that way again when he called. Story 4. My boss called me at 7 in the morning on a Saturday to ask if I could lay some flooring for a friend of his at nearly half my usual rate. That is a hard no, Andy. Story 5. I informed my ex that I was getting remarried. He responded by saying he would stop me and place a lien on my house, which I had purchased with my own money 6 years after the divorce. My son would come home from visitations saying that his dad was going to stop the wedding and that I would have to pay him a large sum of money. When we got to court, his attorney went on for what felt like an eternity. My lawyer stood up and handed the judge the divorce papers showing the disbursement of funds and that my ex was not entitled to anything. The judge looked at my ex's lawyer and basically asked if they had even requested this document before filing. Then he dismissed the case. Story 6. A friend of mine grew up in a very strict and sheltered home. They did not have a single television in the house. We all left for college and returned home for Christmas break, and a group of us planned to go to a movie. I went to pick her up, and as she was saying goodnight to her family, her mom said, "I think 9:30 is a fair curfew?" She replied, "Mom, the movie starts at 8:30. I'll come home when it's over." Her mom acted like she had been slapped and tried to assert herself by saying, "Well then, I'm sorry, but you'll have to stay in tonight." Then, she became my hero by saying, "I'm going to the movie. It's up to you whether I come home after or go back to my apartment in College Station." Story 7. I once watched a manager try to enforce a rule that didn't apply outside his department, only to be told, "You have no power here." It was a classic moment of someone being put in their place. Story 8. It happens to me all the time. I own the bar and people always say, "I know the owner," or "Let me talk to the manager." "Hi, it's me." Story 9. Being a casino manager was often satisfying because once I decided someone was banned, that was it. They were leaving, we were just deciding how. I caught a massive credit fraud group that all played on one person's card to bank points. To make matters worse, he was manipulative and harassed the dealers. He did everything possible to avoid being removed. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes, I see you every night." "It doesn't matter." "I've spent $2 million this year." "Yes, that doesn't matter." "I'll call the general manager and get you fired." "Here's her number." "It doesn't matter." "I'm drunk and didn't mean to." "Yes, and that doesn't matter." "I refuse to leave." Points broadly at security. "It doesn't matter." "You are racially profiling me." "I will sue." "Here's the number for legal." "It doesn't matter." Shoves phone in my face. "I'm going to ruin you on social media." "Hi everyone. This person is being kicked out for harassment and fraud." Waves. "I won't move, and you can't touch me. The sheriff can." Asterisk dials the sheriff's line. Asterisk. Asterisk pushes me. Asterisk. Time for the good old ejection out the front. Story 10. I was breaking up with a long-term girlfriend when she hit me with, "You'll never find anyone like me again." I just started laughing, which was probably unkind, but if I wanted a girl like her, I doubt I would be breaking up with the best example I had of a girl like her. Walking away, I knew I had made the right choice. It was absolutely clear. Story 11. Background. I work at a nonprofit that provides services to the homeless and addicted. One of the services we provide is a rehabilitation program for people with addiction issues. Sometimes, individuals convicted of drug-related crimes are required to complete a rehabilitation program as part of their sentence or for probation reasons to keep them out of jail. We get many of these individuals. The probation department usually sends officers out once a week to check on the people here who are court-ordered. Main story. One day, the chief operating officer received a call from an important person in the probation department. He inquired about the last time we administered a drug test to one individual and requested to check if he was following the program's rules. The person in question had left 5 days earlier. We aren't a prison. They can leave any time they wish. The probation department representative was furious and complained that no one had informed him or his office. To which the chief operating officer responded that the officers hadn't come out since the individual left. The probation officer then demanded that we conduct drug tests and send daily reports to his office about everyone here who was court-ordered. The chief operating officer laughed when he heard this. We receive no funding from the county or the probation department. We rely on donations from members of the community. The chief operating officer told him that once county law enforcement starts making significant donations to our facility, then they could discuss it further. In the meantime, the county probation office can take their requests elsewhere. The probation officer believed he could intimidate the chief operating officer into compliance by threatening searches and other irrelevant actions. The chief operating officer informed him that if he or his officers attempted to enter the facility without permission, he would have them arrested for trespassing. To emphasize his point, he joked that they could handcuff themselves. After a few more terse exchanges, the call ended. The chief operating officer never complied. The probation officer did not call back with similar demands, and the probation officers continued to visit once a week. Story 12. I've had many experiences, but one of my favorites was when I was working security at a club on the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles. Darren McFadden of the Arkansas Razorbacks, who would win the Heisman Trophy that year, tried to enter the club. I was at the door and he didn't have an ID. I didn't let him in. He threw a tantrum and insisted, "Don't you know who I am?" Yes, I did know, and no, I didn't care. Story 13. I was volunteering to help a student band organization. I performed regular website updates, sent weekly email updates, and managed an email list server. One parent criticized me over what I considered a trivial matter, claiming he received an irrelevant email despite having deliberately subscribed to that group. I responded, "I'm a volunteer. You're welcome to volunteer to take my place." That was the last I heard from him. As a side note, I created a complaints email account that automatically signed users up for the "I'd like to volunteer" group. What better way to address your dissatisfaction? Story 14. I was waiting for a friend to finish her shift at a restaurant so upscale that they had someone screening guests at a podium outside. The place was glamorous, and the elite flocked there in droves. Those with reservations were welcomed inside, while potential walk-ins had to wait in line. Suddenly, a car pulled up, and the driver jumped out to hold the door open for a woman dressed in an extravagant hat and gown. This woman, a minor actress from a regional daytime television show, surveyed the crowd and attempted to enter. She froze in shock when the guest vetter stepped in her way, asking, "Do you have a reservation?" She seemed not to hear the question and instead straightened up to her full height, demanding, "Do you know who I am?" "Yes," replied the maitre d'. "Back of the queue." Story 15. The first time I had dinner at my parents' house after moving into my own apartment, my dad was teasing me as he always does. Eventually, I stood up and said, "I don't live here anymore. I don't have to deal with this. I'm going home." And I walked out. It was the most freeing moment of my life. Story 16. A mother and daughter walked into our business. The daughter proceeded to open and damage certain items, which we found out after they had left the store. We printed and hung their photos in our establishment, as we have over 20 cameras in a 3,000 square foot area. A few days later, the mother returned, screaming and yelling. I kindly explained to her what had happened, but she was not receptive. She threatened to call the police on me. I replied, "Please do, you'll only be helping me." The police arrived and were told what had transpired. They asked what I wanted to do, and I requested that she pay for the damages and never return. She refused to pay and insisted that it was her daughter who had caused the damage, claiming that her daughter is a minor and she did not want to take responsibility. She kept refusing and attempted to walk out. The police stopped her, informing her that if she didn't pay, she would be arrested for property damage. She continued to yell that it was her daughter's fault. In the end, she paid for the damages and stormed out. 3 police officers looked at me and gave me a knowing glance, and I simply nodded. In another incident, a man came in wanting to return a product that was not returnable. He yelled and created a scene, threatening to call the police, which he did. While on the phone with the 911 operator, he realized he was getting nowhere, so he slowly walked out and never returned. Story 17. I don't know, but I particularly enjoyed getting out of the army and finally addressing egotistical sergeants by their first names. Story 18. There was a heavy rainstorm, and a section of the road flooded that usually does not. My sister tried to drive through, not realizing how deep it was, and promptly swamped the car. She called her husband, who called me, and we went to retrieve her car from the growing lake. Since we were already knee-deep in water, we decided to be helpful and push some other cars out that had gotten stuck. While we were actively pushing cars out of the water, another car approached. We waved the driver down and informed him that the road was not passable and that he needed to take a different route. He rolled his eyes and proceeded to drive into the water. As expected, his car got swamped and stalled. He yelled for us to come over. We walked over, and he said, "You need to push my car out before the water comes through the door." My brother-in-law and I looked at him and said, "We don't have to do anything," and walked away. It was great to hear him screaming and cursing at us. Then watching him open his car door to get out, with water rushing in and flooding the interior. Story 19. When I finally realized I didn't want or need anything from my mom, anything she said that was critical of me just rolled off and fell away. Story 20. When I visited my mom on my 40th birthday and she was passive-aggressive, patronizing, and emotionally manipulative one time too many, I walked out and haven't seen or spoken to her since. It was one of the hardest, easiest decisions of my life. Story 21. Every time my university reaches out trying to persuade me for an alumni donation, they even use a lottery for a chance to buy football tickets as an enticement. No, sorry, you have no influence, and you will not receive another cent from me to add to your $19 billion endowment. I do not care about attending a football game. Story 22. Advising a client that testifying in his own defense for his upcoming criminal jury trial was not recommended based on the evidence and facts of the case. He asserted his right to testify but struggled when answering the prosecution's questions. He was found guilty on all counts of child molestation and was sentenced to 30 years in the Department of Corrections. Story 23. I have another story I almost forgot about. When I separated from my ex-wife during the legal proceedings, I was held harmless for any debt, including a car payment for which she was responsible. She fell behind on payments, and I began to receive threatening calls from the car finance company. I explained that it was my ex's car and that I had a court order stating I was not responsible for the debt. They would instruct me to send in the court order, and I complied. However, they did not recognize the court order and insisted that I either make a payment or the car would be repossessed. I informed them where to find the vehicle. Story 24. I had a job I hated in debt collection. The work was emotionally draining, and the department head had a personality and management style I can only describe as a hybrid of Bill Lumbergh from Office Space and Dr. Evil. He was really annoying. He would suddenly appear and linger around your cubicle, talking about how great he was when he had been on the collection floor, offering unsolicited advice and criticism, trying to crack jokes, and issuing threats. His threats were so bad that he caused one young woman to have a nervous breakdown at her desk, which he later made jokes about. One of his favorite things to do was bait you into giving him an excuse to call you into his office for a pep talk that consisted of insults and more threats. He wasn't our direct superior, but he was related to someone even higher up the chain, so there was no ignoring him. We all despised him. One day, I had enough of him and the job in general. I came into the office in jeans and a t-shirt, cleaned out my desk, and gave my resignation letter to my direct supervisor, who was a pretty chill person. She actually told me she envied me for quitting. Great workplace. On the way out of her office, the manager, cup of coffee in hand and leaning against a wall, eyeballed my choice of dress, smirked, and asked, "Is something wrong?" I replied, "Nope," and smiled at him. He stood there confused as I scooted around him and went to the door to the stairwell. I heard him start to say, "Ah," as I pushed through the door but didn't stay to hear the rest. It was great. Story 25. Not that crazy, but whenever I receive a text, call, or email from work, I ignore it until my next workday. I don't get paid to text or call people from home. You can wait until I am actually at work, and then I will start working again. It's a great realization that you have no obligation to respond when you're not being paid and not on the clock. Results may vary depending on your place of employment. Story 26. I broke up with my ex, but we bought a car together. I gave her the car and she gave me my half of the payment. I already have my own car, so at least she gets to keep it. 2 weeks later, she called. The car wouldn't start. I asked her if she had used it since we broke up. She said no. I told her it was probably just a battery issue and that she should get it changed. She didn't know how. She begged me to fix it for her. I responded, "You do know I don't have any responsibility to do that for you anymore, right? You need to handle it." She called someone, and it was indeed just a battery issue, but she immediately scratched the entire side of the car while driving out of the gate. It must have been tough for her when she realized how much responsibility I took within our household. Oh well. Story 27. I manage a small electronics repair shop, and we often have customers who don't understand how warranties work. One gentleman came in with a laptop that had clearly been damaged by water. He was insistent that this damage must be covered because it just stopped working, and electronics should resist water. After explaining that warranties do not cover water damage, he switched gears. He told me he was a lawyer and would sue us if we didn't honor the warranty. I nodded, reached for a business card, and handed it to him. "That's the number to our legal department. You'll want to speak to Sarah, our head counsel, but you might want to save yourself some time. She taught me everything I know about warranties." He took the business card, muttered under his breath, and stormed out. I never heard from him again. It's always satisfying when you can deflate someone's threats with a dose of reality. Story 28. A police officer once brought a pregnant inmate to our hospital for delivery. He wanted her to remain in handcuffs while she was in labor, citing regulations. The shift nurse, a seasoned professional with 30 years of experience delivering babies, looked at the officer and said, "Your so-called regulations are not my problem. This is my ward. Good grief, she is not able to go anywhere. Take those handcuffs off her right now." To my amazement, he complied. She then told him where to go. "Stay out of our way, and we'll let you know when we're done," she said. Story 29. When I raised a valid point at a work meeting, my manager said to just go home. I walked into the staff room and wrote my notice of 1 week. Ironically, I had jokingly asked what the minimum notice was earlier that day because many people were leaving. I walked back into the meeting, said goodbye to all the staff, and then approached my manager in front of everyone. I said, "This is for you," and slid the notice across her desk with one finger. That was a dead-end job I had been in for a long time, and my life changed as a result of that. Story 30. I used to do security for a venue in Los Angeles where many Latin community events took place, including boxers giving interviews before fights and Mexican singers giving free concerts for charity. A Latin television channel would usually cover these events. One day, I was assigned to security for a major event featuring Canelo Alvarez, Juan Manuel Marquez, and Oscar de la Hoya. Although my duties were primarily for the venue itself, my manager asked me to help keep people out of the boxers' way due to staff shortages. From the very beginning, the drivers were rude, demanding that I open doors for them. I complied at first, but when their behavior became disrespectful, I told them to open the doors themselves. Later, one of the organizers from the television station began barking orders at me unexpectedly. I followed her initial request, but when she yelled at me for something trivial, I just looked at her in disbelief and returned to my post without responding. As I walked away, she screamed, "Hello? Hello?" Story 31. Telling a sergeant who wanted to inspect my locker that I wasn't in his chain of command, with a Bluetooth speaker playing on my bed, was technically correct. However, if he wanted to push the issue, I would have gotten into a spot of trouble. The other person in the room at the time had just had his locker inspected, and both he and I knew that my locker was in complete disarray. It contained a bit of contraband. For clarity, nothing illegal, but for example, some unit and name patches that I had sourced creatively, more knives than I was supposed to have, as well as an excessive amount of chocolate. Story 32. I have a few good stories, but my favorite was confronting a rude customer at a retail store. I was waiting to ask an employee a question when I heard, and then saw, a woman yelling at an employee, calling her names and making threats, saying her apologies were entirely meaningless like her existence. I don't even remember walking over there. I tapped her on the shoulder and said, "I think you need to walk away and calm down." She turned around and started yelling at me, calling for a manager because I touched her. I replied, "What do you think the manager is going to do? I don't work here. I'm a customer just like you. If the manager has any authority to remove problematic customers, you'd be escorted out to whatever overpriced car you drive around as a status symbol every day. You've been such a raging bully that you have an employee on the verge of tears over something that is not their fault and not within their power to resolve to your satisfaction. You throw her apologies back in her face and call her names for it? If you want to get loud with someone, get loud with me because my hands aren't tied, and I'm going to give it right back to you, cowardly, self-absorbed bully." She said a few things, and I stayed between her and the employee until she left. When I turned around, the employee looked very upset. So I apologized and said I hoped I didn't embarrass her. I just couldn't handle seeing someone act that way to anyone, especially someone who couldn't defend themselves or leave. As I started to walk away, a security guard whistled and gestured for me to come over. I thought it was ridiculous that I was going to get in trouble for confronting a bully, but I accepted that's the way it is. When I got to him, he asked what the situation was, so I started to explain that I saw a customer behaving unacceptably toward an employee. While I was talking, 3 other employees came up and said, "Nope, he was just being a good person and helping us get rid of a problem customer. He's not the problem here." The security guard ended up saying, "Next time, try not to be so loud about it. Your voice really carries." To this day, thinking about it gets me fired up. There is literally no better feeling than helping someone who can never repay you and putting a bully in their place. Story 33. I am in the military and I was stationed at a base where each unit has its own bar. I was the bar operator for hours. Our commanding officer was dating another officer. At the time of this story, he was away on leave. She was extremely intoxicated one night and started an argument with me, so I cut her off and asked her to leave. She was screaming about how I was finished and that she would ruin me. He came back and never said a word to me about it. I have no idea what he knows. We have both moved on since then. Story 34. I was in the process of moving into my own place after separating from my ex-wife. My ex would disappear for days at a time, so it was just my son and me, which was fine with me. One day, I took him to the park and decided to get a small pizza for dinner. Coincidentally, she returned shortly after we finished eating and told me I should not be eating pizza because of my weight. I told her that I did not care about her opinion on my diet and continued to prepare for my move to the new house. Story 35. My boss called me into a meeting with my supervisor and exploded at me, insisting that I must follow all directions without question. At one point, he shouted, I am your boss, and you will respect me. I laughed in his face, and my supervisor had to leave the room, pretending to cough. I kept my job but quit a few weeks later once I found a new one. He has since left, and my former supervisor now runs the department and has asked me to return. Story 36. A past supervisor, who was 2 levels above me, assigned me to a shift that he knew I disliked. I was the strongest manager on the team, and this decision created significantly more work for him. Rather than accept the situation, he tried to make me comfortable with the new arrangement and attempted to direct me. I was already planning to leave the company for various reasons related to overall quality of life, so I took care of a necessary medical procedure that I had been postponing. I used about half of my sick time for it, leaving him to cover my shift again, and I made no effort while I was out, even though I could have easily checked emails and provided guidance. I enjoyed my recovery from the procedure. I was not physically capable of doing the job's physical aspects, and I did not engage in the mental parts at all. When I returned, it was only for a short time, and I did the bare minimum since I was already planning to leave. He assigned me trivial tasks, and I consistently found reasons not to accomplish them, volunteering information only if I was asked. I did not complete a single task he assigned. On my last day, I sent out 4 rounds of thank you and goodbye emails. 1 to mentors, 1 to close peers and friends, 1 to individuals I had mentored or managed, and a general 1 to colleagues I was familiar with but did not have a deeper connection with. He was not included in any of them. He also gave me 3 tasks to complete on my last day. I completed none of them and deleted his emails without reading them. If read receipts were enabled, I am sure he noticed that the messages were deleted without being opened. It was my last day, and he had no authority to take action. 6 months later, they still had not found someone qualified to handle all the responsibilities I had managed in that role. I had moved on long ago. My previous direct supervisor, who was not difficult to work with, called and asked me to return. I laughed and declined. He understood and laughed too. Story 37. Personally, it was a school dean attempting to reprimand my friends and me in public, outside of school. His reasoning was that since we were wearing the school uniform, we were still representing the school. I responded by saying, I don't care what you think you control, but outside of school, we don't answer to you. If you follow us or speak to us further, I will call security. We were in a local shopping center and this was after school. The silence was deafening. Story 38. Years of my sister making everything about her and manipulating everyone have taken a toll on me. I told her I was finally putting up barriers. Story 39. As a psychology professor, I occasionally receive inquiries from parents seeking information about their children, all of whom are 18 or older. I can sometimes empathize with these parents, as they are concerned for their kids, but I do not share any confidential information. I often encounter individuals who attempt to extract information I have received in confidence, seeking to use it against a friend or relative as a form of emotional bullying. These individuals are particularly likely to become upset when I refuse their requests. No matter the pressure or threats, I will not disclose confidential information. Story 40. I broke up with my long-distance girlfriend in May. She wanted to make things difficult regarding me sending her belongings back. I was willing to pay half the shipping, but she insisted I pay the full amount. I researched local laws about abandoned property, followed the guidelines, and informed her that she had 30 days to collect her items. After that, they would be considered abandoned. She threatened to escalate the situation if I didn't return her belongings. She claimed to have consulted a lawyer who said that keeping her things was theft, and that I was withholding a house key, which she seemed to think was even worse. Then she started quoting UK law about ownership of personal possessions and asserted that my actions were illegal. However, I don't think it ever occurred to her that we and her possessions were not in the UK. I live 3,600 miles away in North Carolina, and UK law does not apply to me. Since it has been 39 days and she still hasn't retrieved her belongings, I will donate what I can and hope someone nicer and more grateful will appreciate them. Story 41. The company's CEO called me into his office one morning and began discussing how I was not meeting my targets. I had been there for 12 weeks. during which I managed to turn the business around financially by replacing underperforming staff and hiring a strong team. He started outlining various key performance indicators, and I patiently waited for him to finish. I reminded him that I had significantly more senior management experience than he did, pulled up a copy of my contract, and asked where these targets were stated. He accused me of being difficult. I stood up and told him that if he wanted to fire me, he should go ahead and see how that would turn out. I remained resolute and mentioned that I would have another job before leaving the parking lot, emphasizing that my industry experience was unparalleled. I added that my next call after this meeting would be to the union and the financial regulators. It became clear to him that I was not the doormat he presumed I was. Although I have an easygoing personality and do not typically show stress, I am very receptive to my team and adept at managing different people. This individual thought he could place blame on me for issues he had failed to address. Story 42. My wife and I separated and finally got around to getting a divorce 6 years later. My business experienced a huge upsurge shortly thereafter and became far more successful. I got a larger office, took on employees, and everything was working fabulously. So I decided to take a little vacation. Here I am snuggling with my girlfriend in our hotel when I receive a text from my ex about how I am a horrible person for taking my current girlfriend on this big international trip. But I wasn't willing to do that when we were married because we couldn't afford it. Apparently, I am dating children because my girlfriend was 32 and I was 44 at the time, while my ex was 52. My only reply was LOL. There was some additional screeching, but I ignored it. Story 43. I used to provide security for a venue in Los Angeles where many Latin community events took place, including boxers giving interviews before fights and Mexican singers performing free concerts for charity. A prominent Latin television channel would often cover these events. One day, while I was on duty, notable figures such as Canelo Alvarez, Juan Manuel Marquez, and Oscar de la Hoya were scheduled to attend a major event. Although I was assigned to security for the venue rather than the event itself, my manager asked me to help keep the area clear for the boxers due to a staffing shortage. From the beginning, the drivers started being rude, demanding that I open doors for them. I complied initially, but when their behavior became disrespectful, I told them to open the doors themselves. Later, one of the organizers from the television channel began barking commands at me without any warning. I followed her instructions initially, but after she yelled at me for something trivial, I simply looked at her in disbelief and returned to my post without responding. As I walked away, she shouted, "Hello? Hello?" Story 44. Honestly, I have many experiences from being a preschool teacher. A child refuses to eat their lunch because they want a bite of mine, and they start to have a tantrum. Story 45. I was conducting a review for a functional specification I had written. I had just started at the company and was young and inexperienced. An older engineer began asking irrelevant questions that were not pertinent to the design. I didn't know how to handle the situation. The software architect for our group did. He pointed out that the questions were foolish, unrelated to the topic at hand, and politely told him to remain silent if he did not have any constructive feedback for the document we were reviewing. That individual was laid off a couple of years later. I can't say anyone was upset about it. Story 46. It was my first year in the Army. I was a fresh private in mass formation with individuals who had ranks equal to or 9 ranks higher. A soldier named Burks was also a private, but not because he was new. He had amassed 3 Article 15s and was demoted to the lowest rank while being processed for separation from the Army. In this formation, Burks stood right next to me, and behind us were 2 individuals 7 ranks higher. Having just completed 1 station unit training, I was still conditioned to be scared of higher-ranking officers, so I was on my best behavior. Burks, however, was on his phone with his hands in his pockets, seemingly indifferent to everything. The officers behind us shouted in our ears, "How about you unfuck yourself and put your phone away, Private?" Burks, with the grace of a figure skater, turned his head around and shouted back, "How about you lick my ass, crusty lips?" before turning his head back like a performer. I was completely stunned and extremely anxious. The 2 officers behind us were equally astonished and silent, but nothing happened to Burks. They knew he would never follow any commands or orders. He had nothing to lose, was being separated, and simply didn't care. If they couldn't court-martial him, he wasn't concerned. They had no power over him because he didn't fear losing anything. That experience changed my perspective. The conditioned fear of higher ranks disappeared that day. I learned that they truly didn't have power over you if you didn't have anything you were afraid to lose. Story 47. A fictional story, but a good one. It is from the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I'm not spoiling it, but if you know, you know. Story 48. When my godfather was arrested for a driving under the influence charge, he was a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo and a small person at that. He would be closer to a sixth-degree black belt if he weren't constantly in trouble with the law. To clarify, I say he has sixth-degree skills, they just wouldn't give him a belt. While he was getting arrested, nothing the officer did was effective after he got his hands on him, baton, taser, or firearm. The officer was powerless to do anything. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.